rope burned against his neck before they even pulled it tight. Silas Boone had survived 3 winters in the Rockies, fought through the war, and buried a wife in frozen ground, but nothing prepared him for watching his children's faces as the hangman tested the trapdoor beneath his boots. In Montana Territory, 1869, a man could be hanged for stealing bread, but what they didn't know was that the pregnant widow pushing through that crowd was about to rewrite every rule in Cold Creek. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The gallows and the snow. The wind came down from the mountains like a living thing, clawing at the wooden buildings of Cold Creek with fingers made of ice and fury. It was the kind of cold that didn't just bite, it consumed. The kind that made men question why they'd ever left civilization for this God-forsaken stretch of Montana Territory where winter arrived in October and didn't release its grip until May. Silas Boone barely felt it anymore. He stood on the gallows platform, hands bound behind his back, the rough hemp already chafing his wrists raw. Blood from a split lip had frozen at the corner of his mouth. His left eye was swollen nearly shut from where Deputy Morris had gotten a little too enthusiastic with his fists during the arrest. But Silas kept his good eye fixed on the 2 small figures huddled near the general store, Eli and Clara, his whole world watching their father about to die. Eli stood straight, trying to be the man Silas had told him he'd need to become. At 8 years old, the boy's jaw was set hard, his thin shoulders squared against the wind, despite having only a threadbare coat between his skin and the storm. He held his sister's hand so tight his knuckles had gone white. Clara wasn't trying to be strong. At 6, she didn't understand why strength mattered when your father was about to hang. Tears streamed down her dirt-smudged cheeks, freezing in tiny crystals before they could fall. Her lips moved in what might have been prayer or might have been his name. Silas couldn't tell from this distance. He wanted to tell them to look away, wanted to scream it, but the gag they'd stuffed in his mouth made speech impossible, and maybe that was mercy. What words could possibly make this right? Citizens of Cold Creek, Sheriff Wade Harker's voice boomed across the town square, competing with the wind. He was a thick-necked man, with a face like weathered saddle leather and eyes that had gone cold somewhere between the war and whatever had brought him west. We gather here on this December morning to witness justice, justice. The word tasted like ash in Silas's mind. Around 50 townspeople had braved the storm to watch him die. Some looked eager. Entertainment was scarce in a frontier town, and a hanging was better than staring at cabin walls through another endless winter. Others looked uncertain, shifting their weight, pulling their coats tighter. A few women had brought their children, though, whether as punishment or lesson, Silas couldn't guess. Silas Boone stands accused of theft. The sheriff continued reading from a paper that whipped in his hands. On the night of December 14th, he did unlawfully enter Garrett's General Store and steal goods, valued at $23, flour, jerked beef, salt, pork, and 3 tins of milk powder. The value of these stolen goods plus court costs amounts to $31. $31. Silas had seen men win and lose that much in a single hand of poker. In the cities back east, it might buy a decent coat or a week's worth of restaurant meals. Out here, it was the price of a man's life. Mr. Boone is a vagrant with no means to pay restitution, Sheriff Harker went on. He has no property, no collateral, and no family connections of value. Under territorial law, theft of goods exceeding $15 in value by an indigent person is punishable by death. Does the accused have anything to say before sentence is carried out? Deputy Morris yanked the gag from Silas's mouth. The sudden rush of freezing air into his lungs made him cough, and blood spattered onto the platform. Silas worked his jaw, tasting copper and humiliation. Every eye in Cold Creek was on him. He could see Eli squeezing Clara's hand even tighter. "I didn't steal nothing," Silas said quietly. His voice came out rough as gravel. I worked for those goods, chopped wood for Garrett all day from dawn till I couldn't see to swing the axe. He said the food was payment. Mr. Garrett tells a different story, the sheriff said. Says you never worked a lick, just busted his lock and helped yourself. He's lying. You calling a respected businessman a liar? The sheriff's hand moved to the pistol at his hip, a casual threat. Seems to me a man who'd steal food would think nothing of lying about it. Silas felt rage building on his chest, hot and dangerous. He wanted to shout that Frederick Garrett was the biggest liar in Montana territory, that the man ran crooked deals from dawn to dusk, that half the debts in his ledger books were pure fiction. But what good would it do? Garrett had friends in Cold Creek. Silas had no one. My children are starving, Silas said instead, and hated the pleading note that crept into his voice. I came down from the high country because there's no game left up there this season. Every stream's frozen solid. My traps are empty. I needed to feed my kids, so I worked. I worked for that food, and Garrett knows it. Convenient story. Mayor Harlan Pierce stepped forward from the crowd. He was a tall man, well-fed and prosperous-looking in a beaver fur coat that probably cost more than Silas had earned in his entire life. Seems to me a father who cared about his children wouldn't have dragged them into the wilderness to live like animals in the first place. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. I got a cabin up near Timber Ridge, Silas protested. Built it with my own hands. It's not fancy, but it's solid. We got a roof and a stove. We were doing fine until you gambled away your stake money and couldn't afford supplies, the mayor interrupted smoothly. I heard about you, Boone. Mountain men like you are all the same, too proud to work an honest job, too lazy to farm, just living off the land like savages until the land stops providing. Then you come crawling into town with your hand out. That's not true. The shout came from Eli, who'd pushed forward through the crowd. His young voice cracked with desperation. My pa works harder than anybody. He hunts and traps and— Shut that boy up. Mayor Pierce snapped, and two men grabbed Eli by the arms, hauling him back. Clara screamed and reached for her brother. Silas lunged forward against his bonds, and Deputy Morris cracked him across the back of the head with a pistol butt. Stars exploded across Silas's vision. He fell to his knees on the platform, tasting blood again. Enough, Sheriff Harker roared. The law is the law. Silas Boone, you've been found guilty of theft. Sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out immediately. May God have mercy on your soul, because this territory won't. The hangman, a massive silent man named Cole, who'd done this job in 3 different territories, moved forward with the noose. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he fitted the rope around Silas's neck. The hemp was rough and new, the knot positioned just behind Silas's left ear. Professional work. Cole knew his business. Any last words? The sheriff asked, though his tone suggested this was mere formality. Silas looked at his children. Eli had stopped struggling, but his face was twisted with anguish. Clara had buried her face in her brother's coat, unable to watch anymore. Take care of each other, Silas called to them, his voice breaking. Eli, you're the man now. You keep your sister safe, you hear me? And Clara, baby girl, you remember your ma and pa loved you more than anything in this whole world. Clara's wail cut through the wind like a knife. Sheriff Harker nodded to Cole. The hangman pulled a black hood from his pocket. Wait. The word came from somewhere in the crowd, a woman's voice, clear and strong despite the storm. Every head turned. A figure pushed through the mass of onlookers, a woman in her late 20s wearing a simple gray dress, and a wool shawl pulled tight over her shoulders. Even from a distance, Silas could see she was heavily pregnant, moving with the careful gait of someone in her final trimester. Her face was pale but determined, her dark hair whipping in the wind. Abigail Hart. Silas knew her by reputation, everyone in Cold Creek did. She owned the Evergreen Inn, the only decent lodging house within 100 miles. Her husband had died in a logging accident the previous spring, leaving her to run the business alone while carrying their child. "Mrs. Hart," Sheriff Harker said with forced patience, "this is official business. Please step back." "He didn't steal those goods," Abigail said, her voice carrying across the square. She moved closer to the gallows, one hand unconsciously cradling her swollen belly. "He traded work for food. I saw it myself." A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Mayor Pierce's expression turned thunderous. "You saw it," the sheriff repeated, skepticism dripping from every word. "Ma'am, with all respect, you weren't anywhere near Garrett's store that day. Multiple witnesses have confirmed. I saw Silas Boone chopping wood behind the general store from dawn until well past sunset." Abigail interrupted, her voice steady as stone. "I was making deliveries to the restaurant next door. He worked harder than any man I've seen in months. When he finished, Mr. Garrett gave him a sack of provisions. That's not theft, Sheriff. That's honest labor." Frederick Garrett pushed forward, his face red with indignation. "That's a damned lie. Pardon my language, Mrs. Hart, but you're mistaken. I never— Are you calling me a liar, Mr. Garrett?" Abigail's eyes flashed. "Because I'm prepared to swear to what I saw before God and any judge you care to name." The crowd erupted in confused chatter. Silas stared at the woman in amazement. He'd never seen her before in his life. She hadn't been anywhere near the general store that day. He'd been alone except for Garrett and the man's sullen teenage son. Why was she lying for him? "This is preposterous," Mayor Pierce declared, stepping forward. "Mrs. Hart, you're overwrought. The strain of your condition, the grief of losing your husband, it's affecting your judgment. No one blames you for being confused, but—" "I'm not confused," Abigail said coldly. "And I'm not overwrought. I know what I saw." "Then you're mistaken about the date," the mayor said smoothly. "Perhaps you saw Mr. Boone working some other day, and—" "December 14th, Abigail said, "between 7 in the morning and 6:30 in the evening. I remember because it was exactly 1 week before the anniversary of my husband's death, and I was thinking about him while I worked." Her voice caught slightly on the last words, a note of genuine grief that made several women in the crowd look down. Sheriff Harker looked between Abigail and Garrett, clearly unsettled. "Fred, you said there were no witnesses to the alleged work agreement." "There weren't," Garrett sputtered. "She's lying to save him because she's soft-hearted about his children, probably. Women get emotional about—" "I'm not emotional," Abigail said, steel in her voice now. "I'm telling the truth, and if the law in this territory hangs men based on the uncorroborated word of one shop owner against multiple witnesses, then this isn't justice at all." "Multiple witnesses," the sheriff said sharply. "Who else claims to have seen this?" Abigail hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Silas saw her hand tighten on her shawl. She was bluffing, he realized. She'd been nowhere near that store, had no witnesses, was risking everything on a desperate gambit. Before she could answer, another voice rang out. "I saw it too." An elderly woman stepped forward, Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry. "I was hanging wash across the street, saw that man working all day long." Her English was heavily accented, but clear. "And I heard Garrett promise him payment," added Thomas Wright, the blacksmith. He was a quiet man, slow to anger, but respected in the community. "I was shoeing horses in my forge, heard the whole conversation through the wall." Silas's head spun. These people were lying for him. All of them were lying, creating a fiction to match Abigail Hart's invention. Why, he'd never done anything for any of them. Most didn't even know his name before today. The crowd's mood was shifting. Doubt spread like ripples in water. People began to mutter, to question. If multiple witnesses said one thing and Garrett said another, who was really the liar here? Mayor Pierce saw the momentum changing and moved quickly. "This is absurd. These people are clearly coordinating a false story to— Or maybe Fred Garrett's the one lying," someone called from the back of the crowd. "Wouldn't be the first time he's cheated someone." I've been overcharged at his store 3 times this year, another voice added. He tried to tell me flour was $7 a bag when I know it's 4. The crowd was turning against Garrett, now old grievances surfacing. The merchant's face went from red to purple. Sheriff Harker held up his hands. Quiet, all of you. He turned to Abigail. Mrs. Hart, are you absolutely certain about what you're saying? Because if you're lying to obstruct justice, that's a serious crime. Abigail met his gaze without flinching. I'm certain, Sheriff, and I'll do more than just testify. If there's any question about restitution, I'll pay Mr. Boone's debt myself. $31, wasn't it? She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small leather purse. I have it right here. The crowd fell silent. Silas felt tears burning in his eyes from gratitude, from shame, from overwhelming confusion. This woman was spending precious money to save a stranger's life. Mayor Pierce's expression turned calculating. Mrs. Hart, that's very generous but hardly necessary. I'm sure we can resolve this without— I insist, Abigail said firmly. She climbed the gallows steps with careful dignity, despite her pregnancy, moving past the sheriff to stand directly in front of Silas. Up close he could see her eyes were gray like storm clouds, and just as fierce. She pressed the purse into Sheriff Harker's hand. Count it. $31 exactly. The sheriff opened the purse, his face troubled. He counted slowly, laying silver coins on the railing. When he finished, he looked at Mayor Pierce with an expression that said, "What now?" The mayor's jaw worked silently. He was trapped, and he knew it. If he pushed for the hanging now, with witnesses contradicting Garrett and full restitution paid, he'd look like a tyrant. The crowd was already murmuring in Abigail's favor. Several people were openly crying, moved by her sacrifice. Well, Sheriff Harker said slowly, if the debt's been paid and there's testimony contradicting the theft charge— He looked at the mayor one more time, seeking guidance. Mayor Pierce's eyes narrowed. He stared at Abigail with barely concealed fury, then at Silas. Whatever game was being played here, whatever the real stakes were, Silas understood in that moment that he'd stumbled into something larger than a simple shoplifting charge. Release him, Pierce said, finally biting off each word. But mark my words, Mrs. Hart, you've made a grave mistake trusting this man. When he robs you blind, or worse, don't come crying to me for help. I'll take that risk, Abigail said quietly. Deputy Morris cut Silas's bonds with obvious reluctance. The rope around his neck was removed, leaving a raw burn. Silas stumbled his legs, nearly giving out after standing rigid with terror for so long. Abigail caught his elbow, steadying him. Her hand was small but surprisingly strong. Can you walk? She asked softly. Yes, ma'am. I don't know how to thank me by getting your children out of this cold. She interrupted. They're half frozen. Silas looked down to see Eli and Clara racing toward him through the crowd. They hit him like small cannonballs, nearly knocking him over. He fell to his knees and wrapped his arms around them, burying his face between their heads. Papa, Clara sobbed. Papa, I thought you were dead. I'm here, baby girl, I'm here. Silas kissed her cold cheek, then Eli's forehead. The boy was trying not to cry, but tears leaked from his eyes anyway. We should go, Abigail said gently. She addressed the crowd, which was slowly dispersing now that the entertainment was over. All of you should get inside. This storm's only going to get worse. As people began to shuffle away, Silas heard the whispers starting. Can you believe she paid for him, a widow spending her dead husband's money on a vagrant? It's unseemly. She always was too soft-hearted. That baby's going to suffer because she can't manage money. Abigail's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She simply turned to Silas. The Evergreen Inn is 2 streets east. Bring your children. You look like you could all use a hot meal. Ma'am, I can't possibly. You can and you will, she said firmly. Unless you'd rather stand here arguing while your daughter turns into an icicle. Silas looked down at Clara, who was indeed shivering violently. Her lips had a blue tinge. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "Thank you, truly." Abigail nodded and started walking. Silas followed each child, holding one of his hands. As they passed the general store, Frederick Garrett stood in the doorway, his expression poisonous. Mayor Pierce stood beside him, speaking in low, urgent tones. Silas looked away quickly and kept walking. The Evergreen Inn rose through the swirling snow like something from a better dream, 2 stories of solid timber construction with glass windows that glowed with lamplight. Smoke rose from 3 chimneys. Even from outside, Silas could smell bread baking. Abigail led them through the front door into a warmth so sudden and complete it was almost painful. The main room held a dozen tables, half of them occupied by guests eating supper. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames crackling cheerfully. Everything was clean, well-maintained, welcoming. Several diners looked up as they entered. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to recognition to thinly veiled disapproval. A woman whispered to her husband, who frowned. "Grace," Abigail called toward the kitchen, "3 more for supper." A young black woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. She stopped short when she saw Silas and the children, her eyes widening. "Mrs. Hart, is this—" "Yes," Abigail said simply. "They'll need the room at the end of the hall, the one with 2 beds. But that's your—" "I know what it is, Grace. Please prepare it." There was quiet steel in Abigail's voice. Grace hesitated, then nodded and disappeared back into the kitchen. Abigail turned to the children. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning." Eli said, his voice small. "We had some hardtack Pa had saved." Abigail's expression tightened. She knelt down awkwardly given her pregnancy and took Clara's cold hands in hers. "How does chicken stew sound with fresh bread and butter?" Clara's eyes went huge. "Really, really." Abigail smiled, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "And apple pie for dessert if you can finish your vegetables." "We'll finish them," Eli said quickly. "We'll finish everything." "I know you will." Abigail stood steadying herself on a nearby table. "Mr. Boone, you and your children can wash up in the back. There's a basin and clean towels. Take your time." "Ma'am," Silas's voice cracked, "I don't understand why you're doing this." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. In her eyes he saw something he recognized, the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd lost everything and built it back through sheer will, the loneliness of surviving when others didn't. "Because I know what it's like to watch your children go hungry," she said quietly. "And I know what it's like when no one helps." She touched her belly gently. "And because I want my child to grow up in a world where people choose mercy when they can." She turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving Silas standing in the warmth of the inn with his children alive against all odds, saved by a woman he'd never met who'd risked everything to stand between him and the rope. In the corner, unnoticed, Mayor Harlan Pierce's brother-in-law sat nursing a whiskey, watching everything, already composing the letter he'd write to the mayor about this development. Outside, the storm intensified, burying Cold Creek under 2 feet of fresh snow. And in the gathering darkness, men began to gather in the back room of the saloon, talking in low voices about property rights and moral corruption, and women who didn't know their place. The reprieve from the gallows was real, but the danger was far from over. The chicken stew was the best thing Silas Boone had tasted in 3 years, maybe longer. He watched his children eat with a mixture of relief and shame, so profound it threatened to choke him more effectively than any hangman's rope. Clara had sauce on her chin and crumbs in her hair, and she was smiling, actually smiling. When was the last time he'd seen that Eli ate with forced slowness, trying to maintain dignity, but Silas saw how the boy's hands trembled as he tore into the bread. 8 years old and already learning to hide his desperation, already learning that the world didn't care if you were hungry. Grace appeared beside their table with the pot, her expression cautious but not unkind. She was younger than Abigail, perhaps 22 or 23, with intelligent eyes that seemed to measure everything. "Please," Eli said, then remembered his manners. "Please, ma'am, thank you." Grace ladled another generous portion into his bowl, then Clara's. She glanced at Silas. "You too, Mr. Boone, you're thin as a rail." "I'm fine," Silas said automatically, though his stomach was already growling again. "You're not fine," Grace said flatly. "You're half-starved and you just nearly got hanged. Eat." She filled his bowl without waiting for permission. Across the dining room, Silas could feel eyes on them. The other guests weren't openly staring, but he caught the sidelong glances, heard the whispers that died when he looked up. A well-dressed couple in the corner made a point of finishing their meal quickly and leaving coins on the table before hurrying out. The woman pulled her shawl tight as she passed, as if poverty might be contagious. Abigail emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of dirty dishes. She moved carefully, one hand supporting her lower back. Silas started to rise to help, but she waved him down. "You sit. Eat." She deposited the tray on the bar and came to their table. "How is everything?" "It's wonderful," Clara said, her voice muffled by a mouthful of bread. "It's the best food in the whole world." "I'm glad you think so, sweetheart." Abigail's smile was genuine, but Silas saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting trouble. "Mrs. Hart," Silas said quietly, "what you did today, I don't have words for it, but I need you to know that I will pay you back. Every cent. I don't know how long it'll take, but I swear to you." "We'll talk about that later," Abigail interrupted gently. "Right now your children need rest more than I need promises." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "The room upstairs has 2 beds and a stove. There are blankets, clean ones. Grace will bring up hot water for washing. You're giving us a room." Eli's eyes went wide. "A real room with beds." "Just for tonight," Abigail said, but something in her tone suggested she hadn't quite decided that yet. "The storm's getting worse. It wouldn't be Christian to send you back out there." "It wouldn't be smart business either," Grace muttered, returning with the coffee pot. Half the paying guests already checked out after the scene in the square today. Mrs. Pemberton said she wouldn't stay in an establishment that harbored criminals, as if she's some saint herself. "Grace," Abigail said warningly, "I'm just saying." Grace poured coffee for Silas and Abigail, pointedly skipping the cups of the remaining guests who were pretending not to listen. "People in this town have short memories when it comes to their own sins, and long ones when it comes to everyone else's." A man at the corner table stood abruptly, threw some coins down, and left without a word. His companion, an older woman, who might have been his mother, followed with her nose in the air. Abigail watched them go, her expression carefully neutral. "That's 5 rooms empty now, out of 12. You're losing business because of us," Silas said, guilt twisting in his gut. "Ma'am, maybe it would be better if we—" "Better if you what? Slept in the street?" Abigail's gray eyes flashed. "That's what they want, you know. For you to disappear quietly, so they can all go back to pretending poverty and injustice don't exist in their precious town." She set down the coffee pot with more force than necessary. "Well, I'm done pretending. Mrs. Hart, Abigail," she said, "if you're going to be under my roof, you might as well use my name." Silas didn't know what to say to that. The informality felt dangerous somehow, like crossing a line he couldn't uncross. But she was looking at him expectantly, waiting. "Silas," he offered finally, "and this is Eli and Clara." "I know." Abigail's expression softened as she looked at the children. "Clara told me while you were washing up. She also told me you can shoot a squirrel from 100 yards and that you know 17 different animal calls." Clara beamed with pride. "He taught me 6 of them. Want to hear my owl?" "Maybe not in the dining room," Silas said quickly, though he couldn't help smiling. "Folks might think we're stranger than they already do." "Let them think what they want," Abigail said. She pulled out a chair and sat down with a small sigh of relief, rubbing her belly absently. "How far along are you from your cabin, the one near Timber Ridge?" "About 15 miles into the high country," Silas said. "Takes most of a day to get there, longer in winter. It's good land, or it was before." He trailed off, not wanting to explain the full extent of how bad things had gotten. Before the game disappeared, Abigail finished for him. "Grace's brother is a trapper. He says this has been the worst season in memory." "Worst in 10 years, easy," Silas confirmed. "Something's driven the animals deeper into the mountains. Maybe that new mining operation up north, or maybe just a bad cycle. Either way, my traps have been empty for weeks. I tried fishing, but the ice is too thick and the holes freeze over faster than I can keep them open." He looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of hard living. "I never meant for it to get this bad. I had supplies laid in, but Clara got sick back in October. Fever that lasted 2 weeks. I had to burn through our stores, keeping her warm and fed." "Is she fully recovered?" Abigail asked with concern. "Yes, ma'am." "Abigail," he corrected himself. "She's tough, tougher than she looks." "I'm the toughest," Clara announced, then ruined the effect by yawning hugely. "I can see that," Abigail said with amusement. "But even the toughest need sleep. Grace, would you show them to the room?" Grace nodded and gestured for them to follow. Silas helped Clara down from her chair. The girl was practically asleep on her feet, and picked her up. She nestled against his shoulder with a contented sigh. Eli walked beside him, trying to look alert despite the exhaustion evident in every line of his small body. "Pa," he whispered, "is this really happening? Are we really safe?" "For tonight," Silas whispered back. "Don't get too comfortable, son. We can't stay." "Why not?" Eli's voice carried a note of desperation. "She said we could stay. She's nice, and it's warm here, and there's food, and it's not our place," Silas said firmly. "We're not charity cases, Eli. We're Boones. We take care of ourselves." But even as he said it, Silas felt the words ring hollow. What had he been doing in that general store if not begging for charity? What was he doing now? Eating food he hadn't earned, preparing to sleep in a bed he couldn't pay for. The room Grace led them to was at the end of the upstairs hallway. It was small but immaculately clean, with 2 narrow beds covered in patchwork quilts, a pot-belly stove already radiating heat, and a window that looked out over the snow-covered main street. A washstand held a pitcher and basin, and there were towels folded neatly on a shelf. "Mrs. Hart keeps this room for emergencies," Grace said, lighting the lamp on the bedside table. "Last time it was used was when the minister's family got snowed in during the spring thaw." She paused at the door. "There's a chamber pot under the bed. Privy's out back if you need it, but I wouldn't recommend going out in this storm. Breakfast is at 7. Don't be late or you'll miss the good bacon." "Grace," Silas said, "why did you lie for me today about seeing me work at the store?" Grace looked at him steadily. "I didn't lie. I said I heard Garrett promise you payment, and I did heard him promise it to plenty of other men who worked for him, then claim they were thieves when it came time to settle up. Maybe I didn't hear your specific conversation, but I heard enough to know what kind of man Fred Garrett is." She shrugged. "Besides, Mrs. Hart needed backing, wasn't about to let her stand alone." "Still," Silas persisted, "you could get in trouble. Perjury wasn't in court, so it wasn't perjury," Grace said practically. "And anyway, I don't answer to men like Mayor Pierce or Sheriff Harker. I answer to my conscience and to Mrs. Hart, and both of them sleep fine with what I did today." She softened slightly. "Your little girl was crying like her heart would break. Some things matter more than legal technicalities." She left before Silas could respond, closing the door gently behind her. Silas laid Clara on one of the beds. She was already asleep, her small chest rising and falling peacefully. He pulled off her worn boots. She'd need new ones soon. The soles were nearly gone, and covered her with the quilt. Eli climbed into the other bed without being told, but his eyes tracked Silas's every movement. "Pa, what happened today, with the hanging and Mrs. Hart and everything? I don't understand it." Silas sat on the edge of Eli's bed, suddenly feeling every one of his 34 years. Son, sometimes in this world you meet people who choose to be kind when they don't have to be. Abigail Hart is one of those people. But why did she lie? You weren't working at the store that day. You told me yourself Garrett locked you in after dark and called the sheriff. Smart boy, too smart sometimes. I know. So she saved you by lying. Yes. Eli processed this, his young face serious in the lamplight. Is lying okay if it saves someone? Silas was quiet for a long moment. This was the kind of question his wife would have been better at answering. Sarah had always known the right words, the right lessons. He was just stumbling through, trying not to damage these children any more than life already had. I think, he said finally, that there's a difference between lying to hurt someone and lying to stop an injustice. What Garrett did, claiming I stole when I'd worked, that was a lie meant to hurt. What Abigail did was tell a different truth. Not the truth of what happened, but the truth of what should have happened. Does that make sense? Not really, Eli admitted. Yeah, Silas sighed. Me neither. But I know this, what she did was brave, and it was kind, and we're going to honor that by being respectful guests, and by leaving as soon as this storm clears. We're not going to take advantage. Where will we go? The question hung in the air like the snow outside, swirling and uncertain. Silas didn't have an answer. Back to the cabin, there was nothing there but cold and empty traps. Stay in town, with what money? Doing what work? We'll figure it out, he said, trying to sound confident. We always do. But Eli's expression suggested the boy was old enough now to know when his father was lying. Downstairs, Abigail Hart sat at the small desk in the corner of the kitchen, working through her accounts by candlelight. The numbers didn't look good. They hadn't looked good for months, but tonight they looked particularly grim. Grace was washing the last of the dishes, her movements efficient and practiced. How bad? She asked without turning around. 5 empty rooms, Abigail said. That's 40% of my capacity. And the Hendersons sent word they're canceling their standing reservation for the winter. That's another $12 a week. Because you saved a man's life. Because I consorted with a criminal, according to Mrs. Henderson's note. Abigail set down her pen with disgust. Never mind that her husband was caught cheating at cards last month. Never mind that their son got drunk and broke 3 windows at the saloon. But heaven forbid I show mercy to a starving father. Grace dried her hands and came to stand beside the desk. You could tell them it was a mistake. Say you were confused about what you saw, apologize to Garrett, send the Boones on their way. Folks would forgive you eventually. I could, Abigail agreed. She looked up at Grace. Is that what you think I should do? Hell no, Grace said firmly. I think you should tell them all to go straight to the devil. But I'm not the one who's 7 months pregnant and trying to run a business. Abigail laughed despite herself. Sometimes I forget you're the practical one. Someone has to be. Grace pulled up a chair. Tell me what you're really worried about. Abigail was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on her swollen belly. The baby kicked a strong flutter against her palm. Harlan Pierce came to see me last week, before all this, with Silas. He made an offer on the inn. Grace's expression darkened. What kind of offer? A generous one, actually. $1,500. That's more than fair market value, which means he wants something else. The land, Abigail said. He was very interested in the property itself. Kept asking about the boundaries, whether my deed included the creek access, how far back my lot extended. And you said? I said no, of course. This inn is all I have. It's my livelihood, my home. It's where Thomas and I built our life together. I'm not selling it, not to Pierce or anyone else. Grace looked troubled. Mrs. Hart, Abigail, you know what kind of man Harlan Pierce is. He doesn't take no for an answer, especially not from women. I know. Abigail's jaw set stubbornly, but I also know the law. This property is deeded to me free and clear. My husband paid off the mortgage 2 months before he died. Pierce can't force me to sell. The law, Grace said slowly, didn't stop them from nearly hanging an innocent man this morning. The law is only as good as the men who enforce it, and in this town Pierce owns most of those men. Sheriff Harker isn't corrupt, Abigail protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Sheriff Harker does what he's told, Grace corrected, and he's told by the mayor, who happens to be Pierce's best friend since they were boys back in Missouri. You think it's coincidence that Garrett accused Silas right after you refused Pierce's offer? Abigail felt cold despite the warmth of the kitchen. You think Pierce arranged it? The theft charge. I think Pierce wants your land, and I think he'll use whatever leverage he can find to get it. A widow who consorts with criminals and shows poor judgment might find herself losing customers, struggling to pay taxes, getting cited for code violations. Grace ticked off possibilities on her fingers. Enough pressure and you might decide selling is your only option. That's extortion. That's business frontier style. Grace's expression was grim. I've seen it before. My family down in Kansas, we had land. Good land. White men wanted it, so they found reasons we couldn't keep it. Legal reasons, official reasons. Didn't matter that we'd farmed that land for 3 generations. Didn't matter that we had deeds and papers. They wanted it, and they took it. Abigail felt sick. Grace, I'm sorry. I didn't know. How could you? We don't talk about it. Grace's voice was steady, but her eyes were haunted. Point is, I know how these things work. And I'm telling you, Harlan Pierce is not going to stop just because you said no once. Today's hanging wasn't about stolen food. It was about sending you a message. What message? That he has power and you don't. That he can take a man's life on a whim and nobody will stop him. That if you keep defying him, there will be consequences. Grace leaned forward. You saved Silas Boone today, and that was brave and right. But you also painted a target on your back. Pierce won't forgive that. Abigail sat in silence, absorbing this. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. The storm showed no signs of letting up. What would you do? She asked finally. If you were me, Grace considered, I'd be very, very careful. I wouldn't trust anyone who's friendly with Pierce. I'd document everything, every threat, every strange occurrence, every code violation that suddenly appears. And I'd make sure I had friends who'd stand with me when things got ugly. Friends like you. Friends like me, Grace confirmed. And maybe friends like the half-starved mountain man upstairs who owes you his life. I didn't save him, so he'd be indebted to me, Abigail said quickly. I know that, but he doesn't know that. And honestly, you could use someone who knows how to survive, someone who's not afraid of hard work or hard men. Grace stood stretching. I'm just saying, maybe don't be so quick to send him away when the storm clears. She left Abigail alone with her thoughts and her ledger, and the baby rolling restlessly inside her. Upstairs, Silas couldn't sleep. He lay in the darkness listening to his children's breathing. Clara's soft and even Eli's slightly raspy from a cold. He couldn't quite shake. The bed was too comfortable, the room too warm. He felt like an imposter, like any moment someone would burst through the door and drag him back to the gallows where he belonged. He'd been telling himself a story for 3 years, ever since Sarah died. The story went like this. I'm a good father. I'm providing for my children. We're surviving on our own terms, free and independent, the way people were meant to live. But tonight, lying in borrowed comfort and digesting borrowed food, the story fell apart. He wasn't providing. He'd nearly gotten himself killed over a few dollars worth of flour. His children had been eating hardtack and snowmelt, while he insisted on his pride on doing things the right way, on not asking for help. What kind of father let his 6-year-old daughter cry herself to sleep from hunger? What kind of man watched his son grow old before his time, learning to hide fear and need behind a stoic mask? The truth was brutal and unavoidable. He was failing, had been failing for months, maybe longer. The knock on the door was soft, barely audible. Silas sat up, careful not to wake the children. Abigail stood in the hallway, a shawl wrapped around her nightgown, carrying a tray. "I saw your light was out, but thought you might not be sleeping," she said quietly. "I brought tea and some cake left over from supper. You didn't have to—" "I know," she interrupted gently. "May I come in?" Silas hesitated, aware of the impropriety, a widow and a single man alone at night. But she was already stepping inside, setting the tray on the small table by the window. He noticed she left the door open, maintaining decorum. They sat on opposite sides of the table, speaking in whispers, so as not to wake the children. Abigail poured tea from a small pot, her movements graceful despite her pregnancy. "I wanted to talk to you," she said, "about what happens next." Silas's stomach tightened. "We'll leave in the morning, soon as the storm breaks." "That's not what I meant." Abigail paused, choosing her words carefully. "Silas, I'm going to be direct, because I think you're a man who appreciates honesty. I need help. The inn is too much for Grace and me to manage alone, especially with the baby coming. My husband used to handle repairs, maintenance, dealing with difficult guests. Since he died, things have been difficult." "I'm sure you could hire someone," Silas said, not understanding where this was going. "I could," Abigail agreed, "if I could afford it, but I can't. Most of the men in town charge rates I can't pay, and the ones who might work cheaper are—" She paused delicately, "not trustworthy around women." Silas felt heat rising to his face. "Ma'am, if you're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting a business arrangement," Abigail said firmly. "Room and board for you and your children in exchange for work. Repairs, maintenance, chopping wood, hauling water, whatever needs doing. It wouldn't be charity. You'd be earning your keep." Silas stared at her. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. You don't know anything about me. For all you know, Mayor Pierce was right. I could rob you blind. I could be dangerous." "Are you?" Abigail asked calmly. "No, but you have no way of knowing that. I know you nearly died rather than give up your children. I know you worked yourself to exhaustion trying to feed them. I know you stood on that gallows with dignity, even when you had every right to rage and curse." She met his eyes steadily. "That tells me everything I need to know about your character." "The town will talk," Silas said desperately. "They're already talking. If I move in here, they'll talk either way," Abigail said with a shrug. "They're talking now about how I'm a foolish woman who wasted money on a vagrant. Let them talk. I'm more concerned with keeping my inn running and my child fed than with gossip." Silas was quiet, torn between gratitude and pride, and a fear he couldn't quite name. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked finally. "The truth." Abigail looked down at her tea, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "When my husband died, I had nothing. The logging company that employed him offered me $20 as settlement. $20 for a man's life. I had no income, no prospects, and a child on the way. I was 3 weeks from losing this inn to the bank. What happened? The other loggers took up a collection. Men who barely had 2 coins to rub together gave me what they could. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my mortgage payment. Then they came here and worked for free, rebuilt the roof, fixed the foundation, repaired every broken thing Thomas had meant to get to but never did." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "They didn't ask for anything in return. They just saw someone who needed help and they helped." "So this is you paying it forward," Silas said. "This is me remembering what grace looks like," Abigail corrected, "and choosing to extend it when I can." Before Silas could respond, a loud crash from downstairs made them both jump. Glass shattering followed by shouting. Silas was on his feet, instantly moving toward the door. "Stay here," he ordered Abigail. "Like hell," she said, following right behind him. They rushed downstairs to find Grace standing in the dining room, a shotgun in her hands, aimed at the broken window. Cold wind and snow poured through the shattered glass. On the floor, surrounded by glittering shards, lay a brick wrapped in paper. Someone threw it, Grace said, her voice shaking with fury, rode by on horseback and threw it right through the window. Silas moved cautiously to the window, staying to the side, in case the attacker was still out there. He could see hoofprints in the fresh snow already being filled by the storm. Whoever it was had fled. "What does the note say?" Abigail asked, moving toward the brick. Silas got there first, unwrapping the paper with careful hands. His jaw tightened as he read the crude letters scrawled in lampblack. "What does it say?" Abigail repeated, her voice tight. Silas looked at her, then at Grace, then back at the note. He read aloud, "Whores and thieves deserve each other. Leave Cold Creek or burn with it." The three of them stood in the wreckage, and the cold, the threat hanging in the air like the snow, and Silas understood with terrible clarity that Abigail Hart's kindness had just put her in mortal danger, and it was his fault. The wind howled through the broken window, scattering snow across the dining room floor like an accusation. Silas stared at the note in his hands, the words blurring as rage built hot and dangerous in his chest. 3 years of scraping by, 3 years of keeping his head down and his fists to himself, and now this. Someone had threatened a pregnant woman because she'd shown him mercy. "We need to board up that window," Grace said, her voice cutting through his fury. She still held the shotgun, her knuckles white on the stock. "Before we all freeze to death standing here." Abigail had gone pale, one hand pressed against her belly. For a moment she looked fragile, breakable. Then she straightened and Silas saw steel slide back into her spine. "There's lumber in the shed out back. Thomas kept spare boards for repairs." "I'll get them," Silas said, already moving toward the back door. "Not alone, you won't." Grace followed him, shotgun still in hand. Whoever threw that brick might be waiting. They stepped out into the storm, and the cold hit Silas like a physical blow. The snow was coming down so thick he could barely see the shed 30 feet away. His breath came in white clouds as he fought through drifts that reached his knees. The shed door hung open, banging in the wind. Silas's instincts screamed wrong, but he pushed forward anyway. Inside, lumber was stacked neatly along one wall, tools hanging on pegs, everything organized and maintained. Thomas Hart had been a careful man. "Here," Grace said, pulling down boards, while Silas grabbed a hammer and nails from the toolbox. "These should fit the window frame." They loaded themselves with supplies and trudged back toward the inn. Halfway there, Silas caught movement in the corner of his eye. A figure on horseback, barely visible through the snow, watching from the edge of town. He couldn't make out features, but something about the way the rider sat told him this wasn't casual observation. "Grace," he said quietly, "we're being watched." She followed his gaze, her grip tightening on the shotgun. "I see him," she raised her voice, projecting over the wind. "You want to try something, you coward? Come on then." The rider didn't move, didn't respond, just sat there like a sentinel, a promise of violence held in reserve. "Come on," Silas said, pulling Grace toward the inn. "We need to get inside." They barricaded the window as quickly as possible, Silas's frozen fingers fumbling with nails, while Grace held boards in place and Abigail supervised, her face drawn with worry. When they finished, the dining room was dim and cave-like, but at least the wind had stopped. "I should go for the sheriff," Grace said, setting down the shotgun. "No." The word came from Abigail, sharp and final. "Sheriff Harker won't help us. You said it yourself. He answers to men like Pierce." "Then what do we do?" Grace demanded. "Just wait for them to burn us out." "We prepare," Abigail said. She looked at Silas, and he saw something in her eyes that reminded him of soldiers he'd known during the war, men and women who'd reached the point where retreat was no longer possible, where the only option was to dig in and fight. "How good are you with that shotgun?" "Good enough," Silas said. "I can shoot, and I can fight if it comes to that." "It won't come to that," Abigail said, but her tone suggested she didn't quite believe it. "Grace, wake the other guests. Tell them what happened. Give them the option to leave if they want." That'll empty the rest of your rooms, Grace protested. Better empty rooms than dead guests. Abigail moved to the desk where she kept her accounts, pulling out a small metal box. Inside was a pistol, old but well-maintained. Thomas taught me to shoot. I'm not helpless. The sight of the gun in her hands, her pregnant belly visible beneath her nightgown, struck Silas as profoundly wrong. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. Women like Abigail Hart should be safe, should be protected, should be building lives instead of preparing for siege. This is my fault, Silas said. I should leave tonight, take my kids and go, and maybe they'll leave me alone. Abigail's laugh was bitter. You think this started with you? Silas Harlan Pierce has been circling this property like a vulture for months. You're just the excuse he needed. What do you mean? Abigail set down the pistol and pulled out a stack of papers from the desk drawer. Read these. Go on. Silas took the papers, squinting in the lamplight. They were notices, official-looking documents stamped with the territorial seal, code violations for a loose shingle on the roof, a citation for serving food without proper permits, even though Abigail had been serving food for 3 years without issue, a complaint about noise disturbing the peace, a claim that her property line encroached on public land by 3 feet. These are all dated within the last 2 months, Silas said slowly. Ever since I refused to sell to Pierce, Abigail confirmed. Each one comes with a fine, small amounts individually, but they add up. And if I can't pay, she gestured at the inn around them, the territory can seize the property for unpaid debts. That's extortion, Grace said flatly. That's legal, Abigail corrected, or legal enough that no one will stop it. Pierce has friends in the territorial government. They're doing him favors, and I can't prove otherwise. Silas felt sick. He'd seen corruption during the war, had watched officers steal from their own men, had witnessed cruelty dressed up as duty. But somehow he'd thought the frontier would be different. Out here, away from the politics and power games of civilization, he'd believed men and women could build something honest. How much do you owe? He asked. Total for all these citations, $87, Abigail said quietly, and I have until the end of January to pay or they'll auction the inn. $87. The same amount might as well have been 1,000. Silas had 31 cents to his name. There has to be a way, Grace said. Some legal recourse, There isn't, Abigail interrupted. I've already consulted the only lawyer in 3 counties who isn't in Pierce's pocket. He said my best option is to sell before the auction, cut my losses. But you won't, Silas said. It wasn't a question. No, Abigail agreed. I won't. Footsteps on the stairs made them all turn. Eli stood there in his nightshirt, his eyes wide and frightened. Pa, what's happening? I heard shouting and breaking glass. Silas's heart sank. Son, you should be in bed. Someone wants to hurt us, don't they? Eli's voice was steady, but his hands trembled. Because Mrs. Hart helped us, because she saved you. There was no point lying. The boy was too smart, had seen too much. Yes, Silas said simply. Then we should go, Eli said, right now, before anyone else gets hurt because of us. It's not that simple, Grace started, but Eli cut her off. It is that simple. The boy's voice cracked, years of held-back emotion spilling out. Everywhere we go, bad things happen. Ma died and we had to leave our farm. We went to the mountains and nearly starved. We came to town and Pa almost got hanged. Now Mrs. Hart's in danger because she was nice to us. Tears streamed down his face. Maybe we're just bad luck. Maybe people are better off if we're not around. Silas crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled his son into his arms. Eli fought for a moment, then collapsed against his father's chest, sobbing. We're not bad luck, Silas said fiercely. Do you hear me? We've had bad things happen, but that's not the same thing, and we don't run from people who need us. But Mrs. Hart is in trouble whether we're here or not, Abigail said gently, kneeling down to Eli's level. despite her pregnancy making the movement awkward. "The men threatening me aren't angry because you're here, sweetheart. They're angry because I won't do what they want. That's not your fault." "How do you know?" Eli asked, his voice muffled against Silas's shirt. "Because I've met bullies before," Abigail said, "and bullies always find a reason. If it wasn't this, it would be something else." A knock at the front door made everyone freeze. It was past midnight, the storm still raging. No one had legitimate business at this hour. Silas gestured for Grace to get Eli upstairs, then moved toward the door. Abigail raised her pistol, her hands remarkably steady. "Who's there?" Silas called. "Chum?" "Thomas Wright, the blacksmith. I need to speak with Mrs. Hart." Silas exchanged a glance with Abigail. Wright had been one of the men who'd testified on Silas's behalf earlier, claiming to hear Garrett promise payment. But was that genuine help or part of some deeper game? Abigail nodded. Silas opened the door a crack, ready to slam it shut at the first sign of trouble. Thomas Wright stood on the porch, snow collecting on his broad shoulders. He was a massive man, 6.5 feet tall, with the thick arms and scarred hands of someone who worked metal for a living. Behind him were 2 other men, Chen, who ran the laundry, and old Jacob Muller, the carpenter. "Can we come in?" Wright asked. "It's important." Silas opened the door wider but stayed between the men and Abigail. "What do you want?" Wright removed his hat, snow cascading from the brim. "We heard about the brick through your window. Word travels fast in a small town, even at night." He looked at Abigail. "We've come to help." "Help how?" Abigail asked, suspicion evident in her voice. "Guards, first of all," Wright said. "Chen and I will take shifts watching the inn tonight. Make sure no one tries anything else. Muller here is going to reinforce your doors, and windows come morning, proper bars, not just boards." "I can't pay you," Abigail said. "Didn't ask you to," Wright replied simply. "You stood up to Harlan Pierce today. That took guts. Most folks in this town are too scared to cross him, but someone needs to start pushing back." "Why you?" Silas asked. "Why risk it?" Wright's jaw tightened. "Because Pierce's lumber company killed my brother 2 years back. Faulty equipment, corner cutting on safety. When my sister-in-law tried to get compensation, Pierce's lawyers buried her in paperwork until she gave up." He looked at Abigail. "You're not the first person he's tried to destroy, ma'am. Just the first one brave enough to fight in public." Chen stepped forward, a slight man with intelligent eyes and hands stained from laundry chemicals. "My family owes you," he said to Abigail in heavily accented English. "When my wife was sick last winter, you let us delay payment on our room. Could have evicted us, but you didn't. Now we help you." Muller, who had to be 70 if he was a day, just nodded his grizzled head. "Good people are rare, Mrs. Hart. Worth protecting." Silas watched Abigail's face as she processed this unexpected support. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Wright suggested. "Let us help while we still can. Pierce might own the sheriff and the mayor, but he doesn't own everyone. Not yet." "Yes," Abigail said. "Thank you." "All of you." Wright nodded and turned to Silas. "You know how to use that shotgun Grace is hiding upstairs." "I do." "Good. You take the back of the building, I'll take the front. Chen's got the side alley, and Muller will sleep light upstairs." Wright's expression was grim. "I don't think they'll try anything else tonight. The storm's too bad. But come tomorrow, when word spreads that we're backing Mrs. Hart, things could get ugly fast." He was right, and they all knew it. What had started as one woman's act of defiance was becoming something larger, a line drawn in the snow. On one side stood power and money and corrupt authority. On the other stood a pregnant widow, a mountain man, and a handful of people who'd decided that enough was enough. The odds weren't good. They organized themselves for the night watch. Silas sent Eli back to bed, promising to wake him if anything happened. Grace made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and they settled into a tense routine of waiting. Around 3 in the morning, with the storm finally beginning to ease, Abigail came to where Silas sat by the back door. She'd changed into a simple wool dress, her hair braided back, and she carried 2 cups of coffee. "Can't sleep?" Silas asked, accepting the cup gratefully. "Too much on my mind." She settled into the chair across from him with a sigh of relief. "This baby's getting heavy." "How much longer?" 6 weeks, if everything goes according to plan." She smiled faintly. "Though nothing else in my life has gone according to plan, so I'm not holding my breath." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the wind die down and the creak of the old building settling. "I meant what I said earlier," Abigail finally spoke. "About you staying on. The offer still stands even after all this." "Especially after all this, you mean," Silas said. "You need someone who can protect you." "That's not why I'm asking." "Then why?" Abigail looked down at her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "When Thomas died, I thought I'd die too. Not literally, though Lord knows I considered it. But I thought my life was over. No more dreams, no more hope, just survival." She looked up at him. "Helping you today, standing up to Pierce, even all this trouble, it's the first time in months I've felt alive. Like I'm doing something that matters instead of just existing." Silas understood that feeling more than she knew. He'd been existing for 3 years, going through motions, telling himself he was living when really he was just not dying. "I can't promise I won't bring more trouble," he said honestly. "Pierce clearly has it in for me." "Pierce has it in for anyone who doesn't bow down," Abigail corrected. "You're not the cause, Silas. You're just the excuse." She paused. "But if you stay, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you won't leave in the middle of the night thinking you're protecting us. Promise me you'll stay and fight even when it gets hard, even when you think we'd be better off without you." Her gray eyes were fierce. "Promise me you won't run." It was the one promise Silas wasn't sure he could keep. Running had kept him and his children alive for 3 years. Staying, putting down roots, trusting people, that's what had gotten him nearly hanged. But looking at Abigail Hart, pregnant and defiant and braver than she had any right to be, Silas found himself nodding. "I promise," he said. "We'll stay, we'll fight." "Good." Abigail's smile was tired but genuine. "Because I'm going to need you when the real trouble starts." "This isn't the real trouble. This is just Pierce testing our resolve. The real trouble comes when he realizes we're not backing down." She was right. As dawn broke over Cold Creek, painting the snow-covered streets, in shades of gray and gold, word of the brick through the window spread like wildfire. By the time the sun was fully up, half the town knew that Abigail Hart had armed defenders. The other half knew that Harlan Pierce wasn't the kind of man who tolerated defiance. Something had to break. It was just a question of when and how violently. The answer came 2 days later, just as the storm finally blew itself out and the town began digging free from the snow. Silas was in the barn behind the inn, mucking out stalls that hadn't been properly cleaned in weeks. Grace was helping the two of them, working in companionable silence while Eli and Clara played in the hayloft above. "My brother says there's talk," Grace said quietly, pitching soiled hay into a wheelbarrow. "Down at the saloon, men are placing bets on how long the inn stays standing." Silas's hands tightened on his pitchfork. "What kind of talk?" "The usual. That Mrs. Hart's lost her mind. That she's bewitched you somehow, or you've bewitched her. That it's shameful, a widow and a vagrant living under the same roof." Grace's expression was disgusted. "Like people haven't got better things to worry about than who's sleeping where. Are they just talking or planning something?" "Both, probably." Grace leaned on her pitchfork. "My brother says Mayor Pierce has been buying drinks for anyone who'll listen to him complain about moral decay and lawlessness. He's building support for something, but no one knows what yet." A scream from the hayloft sent Silas's heart into his throat. He dropped the pitchfork and ran for the ladder, but Eli's voice stopped him. "It's okay, Pa. Clara just saw a mouse." Silas exhaled, then heard his daughter's voice float down. It was a big mouse with teeth. "All mice have teeth, Clara," Eli said with the long-suffering patience of an older brother. Grace chuckled, but the sound died quickly. "They're good kids. They deserve better than this." "They deserve everything," Silas agreed, "but we give them what we can." "Is it enough?" The question hung in the cold air. Silas didn't have an answer. How much was enough? When did survival become living? When did existing become thriving? A commotion from the street drew their attention. Voices raised in anger, the sound of horses, men shouting. Silas and Grace exchanged a look and hurried out of the barn. A crowd had gathered in front of the inn. At its center stood Sheriff Harker, Mayor Pierce, and a man Silas didn't recognize, tall and lean, with the cold eyes of a professional killer. He wore a deputy's badge, but something about him screamed hired gun. Abigail stood on the porch, Wright and Mueller flanking her. Her hands were folded calmly over her belly, but Silas could see tension in every line of her body. "What's going on?" Silas asked, moving to Abigail's side. "The sheriff has a warrant," Abigail said, her voice carefully neutral. "A warrant for what?" Silas demanded. Mayor Pierce stepped forward, a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "Fire code violations. The inn is deemed unsafe for occupancy. Everyone needs to vacate immediately while repairs are made." "That's ridiculous," Wright growled. "This building's solid as they come. I've inspected it myself." "Your inspection isn't official," the stranger with the deputy's badge said. His voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made him more menacing. "The territorial fire marshal has reviewed the property records and determined significant violations exist. Faulty chimney, inadequate exits, fire hazards in the kitchen." "Who are you?" Silas asked. "Deputy Marcus Stone," the man said. "Just transferred from Virginia City to help Sheriff Harker maintain order." His eyes flicked to Silas, and something in that gaze made Silas's instincts scream danger. This was no ordinary lawman. "I want to see this report," Abigail said. "The official one from the fire marshal." "Of course." Mayor Pierce pulled a document from his coat with a flourish. "Everything's in order, I assure you." Abigail took the papers and read slowly, her face growing paler. "This is dated yesterday. The fire marshal was supposedly here yesterday, conducting his inspection." "That's correct," Pierce said smoothly. "I was here all day yesterday," Abigail said. "No fire marshal came to the inn." "Are you certain perhaps he came while you were occupied with other matters?" "I'm certain," Abigail said firmly. "This is a lie. This entire report is fabricated." "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Hart," Sheriff Harker said, looking uncomfortable. "Are you calling the territorial fire marshal a liar?" "I'm calling someone a liar," Abigail shot back, "and my money's on the men standing in front of me." The crowd murmured. Some faces showed sympathy, others showed disapproval at a woman speaking so boldly to men in authority. "Regardless of your feelings on the matter," Deputy Stone said, his hand resting casually on his pistol, "the law is the law. You need to vacate the premises immediately. You can appeal to the decision, of course, but until then, the inn is closed." "Where am I supposed to go?" Abigail demanded. "I'm 7 months pregnant and this is my home." "I'm sure you have friends who can take you in," Mayor Pierce said with false sympathy. "Perhaps one of these gentlemen who seem so concerned about your welfare." It was a trap, Silas realized. If Abigail stayed with Wright or Chen or any of the men defending her, the gossip would intensify. Her reputation would be shredded. But if she had nowhere to go, Pierce would swoop in with an offer, probably to buy the inn at a fraction of its value, presented as charity. "She can stay at my place," Grace said suddenly. "I've got a spare room." "You live in a boarding house room above the laundry," Pierce said dismissively. "Hardly suitable for a woman in her condition." "Then she can stay in the church," Mueller suggested. "Reverend Patterson wouldn't turn away someone in need." "The church is being renovated," Pierce countered smoothly. He'd thought of everything, blocked every avenue. "I'm afraid there really are no suitable options, which is why I'm prepared to make a generous offer. I'll purchase the inn immediately, $1,500 cash, And I'll even allow Mrs. Hart to rent a room at a reduced rate until she can find other accommodation. There it was, the whole play laid bare. Force her out, make her desperate, then swoop in as the savior while stealing her property. Abigail's hands clenched into fists. I will never sell to you. You may not have a choice, Pierce said. If you can't pay those outstanding citations, the property goes to auction in 5 weeks. At least if you sell to me now, you'll get something for it. 5 weeks. Silas repeated, his mind racing. That was longer than they'd thought. So she doesn't have to vacate today? Deputy Stone's eyes narrowed. The fire code violations require immediate. The fire code says a property owner gets 48 hours to address violations before forced evacuation. Wright interrupted. He pulled a battered law book from his coat. I looked it up. You can't force her out today. Pierce's expression flickered with annoyance. Very well, 48 hours, but then everyone leaves by force if necessary. 48 hours, Abigail agreed. Her voice was steady, but Silas saw her hand shake as she handed back the fraudulent report. The sheriff and his new deputy mounted their horses. Mayor Pierce lingered a moment longer. This doesn't have to be difficult, Abigail. Sell me the inn, take the money, start fresh somewhere else. You're fighting a battle you can't win. I'd rather lose fighting than win by surrender, Abigail said quietly. Pierce's expression hardened. So be it. But when this ends badly, and it will remember that I offered you a way out. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Boone, there's a warrant for your arrest being drawn up as we speak. Seems Frederick Garrett wants to press assault charges. Says you attacked him the night you allegedly stole from his store. That's a lie, Silas said. I never touched him. Prove it, Pierce said with a smile. 48 hours, Mrs. Hart. Use them wisely. They left the crowd dispersing with them, already spreading gossip about what they'd witnessed. Silas stood on the porch watching them go, his mind spinning with scenarios, each worse than the last. We need a plan, Wright said grimly. We need a miracle, Mueller corrected. We need proof, Abigail said. She turned to Silas, and in her eyes he saw determination burning bright as a forge fire. Proof that Pierce is behind this. Proof that these violations are fake. Proof that will hold up even against corrupt officials. How do we get that? Grace asked. Abigail looked at each of them in turn. We fight dirty. If Pierce wants to play games with the law, we'll show him that two can play. But I need to know, all of you, are you with me? Because what I'm thinking, it's risky, it's probably illegal, and if we get caught, we'll all hang. Silas should have walked away, should have taken his children and disappeared into the mountains, left Abigail Hart to fight her own battles. It was the smart play, the safe play, but he'd made a promise. And more than that, he'd found something in Cold Creek he thought he'd lost forever, people worth fighting for, a cause worth the risk. I'm in, Silas said. And me, Grace added. Wright and Mueller nodded their agreement. Abigail's smile was fierce and fearless. Then let's show Harlan Pierce what happens when you corner desperate people. Let's burn his whole empire down. The plan came together in Abigail's kitchen over weak coffee and the kind of desperate courage that only comes when you've got nothing left to lose. They sat around the scarred wooden table, Abigail, Silas, Grace Wright, Mueller, and Chen, who'd arrived with his wife to offer whatever help they could give. Pierce keeps his records in the office above the land registry, Abigail said, spreading a rough map of Cold Creek on the table. She'd drawn it herself, marking buildings and alleys with a steady hand. Every dirty deal, every forged document, every bribe, if there's proof, it'll be there. That office is locked tighter than a bank vault, Wright said. And Pierce has men watching it at night. We'd never get in without being seen. We don't need to get in at night, Silas said slowly, an idea forming. We need a distraction, something big enough that everyone's attention is elsewhere. Like what? Grace asked. Silas looked at Abigail. How attached are you to that barn out back? Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by calculation. The barn was old, half-rotted in places, holding nothing of real value except some moldy hay and broken equipment. "Not very," she said carefully. "But if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, a fire draws everyone," Silas interrupted. "Every able-bodied man in town will come running with buckets, including Pierce's guards. And while they're fighting the fire, someone slips into the office." Wright finished, his expression thoughtful. "It could work." "It's arson," Muller pointed out. "They catch us, we hang." "They're going to destroy us anyway," Abigail said. "At least this way we go down fighting." Chen's wife Lynn spoke up for the first time. Her English was better than her husband's, her voice soft but firm. "There is old saying in my country, when the elephant fights the tiger, the grass suffers. But sometimes the grass must choose a side, or be trampled by both." "Wise words," Grace said. "But we're not just grass anymore. We're the whole damn forest, and we're about to catch fire." They spent the next hour refining the plan. Silas would start the fire. He knew how to make it look accidental, how to control it so it didn't spread beyond the barn. Wright and Muller would join the bucket brigade, watching Pierce's men to make sure they all left their posts. Chen would create a second, smaller emergency at his laundry to further divide attention. That left Grace and Abigail to break into Pierce's office. "No," Silas said immediately when Abigail volunteered. "You're 7 months pregnant. You can't—" "I know the filing system," Abigail interrupted. "I used to do bookkeeping for Pierce before I realized what kind of man he was. Grace is strong, but she won't know what to look for." "I will." "Then I'll go with you," Silas said. "You'll be busy making sure that fire doesn't actually burn down half the town," Abigail countered. "Grace and I can handle this." Silas wanted to argue, wanted to forbid it, but he had no right. Abigail Hart was not his wife, not his responsibility, and she'd made it abundantly clear she didn't need his protection. Still, the thought of her taking such a risk made his stomach clench. "If anything goes wrong," he started. "Then we improvise," Abigail finished. "Same as we've been doing since this whole mess started." They set the plan for the following night. That gave them time to prepare, to gather what they needed, and to make arrangements for the children. Eli and Clara would stay with Lin Chen, who had children of her own and lived far enough from the center of town to be safe from whatever chaos was about to unfold. As the group dispersed to their various tasks, Silas found himself alone with Abigail in the kitchen. She was washing the coffee cups, her movements slow and careful, one hand supporting her lower back. "Let me do that," Silas said, taking the cup from her hands. "I'm pregnant, not an invalid." Abigail protested, but she didn't fight him. Instead, she sank into a chair with a small sigh of relief. "You should be resting," Silas said, pumping water into the basin, "not planning break-ins and arson." "I should be a lot of things," Abigail agreed. "Safe, comfortable, preparing for my baby in peace." She looked down at her belly, her expression softening. "But the world doesn't care what we should be. It only cares what we are." "And what are we? Survivors," Abigail said simply. "People who refuse to lie down and die just because someone powerful tells us to." Silas washed the cups in silence, thinking about survival. He'd been surviving for 3 years, keeping his head down, avoiding trouble, doing whatever it took to keep his children alive. And where had it gotten him? Nearly hanged his children, starving, running from one disaster to the next. Maybe survival wasn't enough anymore. Maybe it was time to actually live, even if living meant risking everything. "I'm scared," Abigail said quietly. "I haven't admitted that to anyone else, but I'm terrified, not just of Pierce, but of what happens if we fail. This baby—" She pressed her hand to her belly. "I'm all it has. If something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," Silas said fiercely. "I won't let it." Abigail smiled sadly. "You can't promise that." "Maybe not, but I can promise I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe, you and that baby both." "Why?" Abigail asked. Why do you care so much? You barely know me." Silas dried his hands slowly, trying to find words for feelings he didn't fully understand himself. "Because you stood up when everyone else sat down. Because you saw my children crying and you did something about it. Because you're the first person in 3 years who's made me believe that maybe the world isn't completely rotten." "That's a lot of pressure to put on one pregnant widow," Abigail said, but her eyes were bright. "You can handle it," Silas said. "You're tougher than anyone I've ever met." Before Abigail could respond, the front door burst open. Eli rushed in, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Pa, you need to see this." Silas followed his son outside to find a crowd gathering in the street. At the center of the commotion was a stagecoach, its sides caked with mud and the horses lathered with sweat. The driver was helping someone down, a man in a dark suit and a badge that caught the winter sunlight. "Who is that?" Abigail asked, appearing at Silas's shoulder. "Federal Marshal," Wright said, joining them on the porch. His expression was grim. "That's Marshal James Calhoun. He's got jurisdiction over the whole Montana territory." Silas's heart began to race. A federal marshal meant the law was here, real law, not the corrupt farce that Pierce and Harker enforced. But it also meant scrutiny questions, and if the marshal was in Pierce's pocket like everyone else. The marshal was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered with iron gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He scanned the crowd with sharp eyes, then his gaze locked on the inn, on Abigail specifically. He started walking toward them, his boots crunching in the snow. "Mrs. Abigail Hart," he asked, his voice a deep rumble. "That's me," Abigail said, lifting her chin. "What can I do for you, Marshal?" "I'm here to investigate reports of criminal activity and corruption in Cold Creek," Calhoun said. "Your name has come up in connection with several incidents." His eyes shifted to Silas. "As has yours, Mr. Boone." Silas's blood ran cold. This was it. Pierce had called in the federal law to finish them off. Whatever evidence they'd planned to steal, whatever desperate gambit they'd hoped to make, it was over before it began. "If you're here on Mayor Pierce's word," Abigail said steadily, "then you should know he's not exactly an impartial source." "I'm here on no one's word," Calhoun said. "I'm here because the territorial governor received an anonymous letter detailing extensive corruption in this district. Forged documents, fraudulent charges, intimidation of citizens." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. The letter was quite detailed. It included dates, amounts, and specific accusations against Mayor Harlan Pierce and Sheriff Wade Harker. Silas and Abigail exchanged shocked glances. Someone had beaten them to it, had already reported Pierce to the authorities. "I don't suppose you know who sent this letter?" Calhoun asked, his eyes moving between them. "No idea," Abigail said honestly. The marshal studied her for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was lying. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll be conducting interviews over the next several days. I'll need to speak with both of you along with several other citizens. In the meantime, I'm hereby suspending all pending legal actions in Cold Creek pending my investigation. That includes property seizures, arrests, and evictions." "You can do that?" Grace asked from the doorway. "I can, and I have," Calhoun said. "Any questions about my authority can be directed to the territorial governor." He turned back to Abigail. "I understand you're facing eviction based on fire code violations." "Supposedly," Abigail said, "though the fire marshal's report is fraudulent. He was never here." "I'd like to see that report," Calhoun said, "along with any other documentation you have regarding citations fees or legal actions taken against you." Abigail nodded and went inside to gather the papers. Silas stood on the porch with the marshal, acutely aware of the gun at the man's hip and the authority he represented. "Mr. Boone," Calhoun said quietly so only Silas could hear, "I've heard some interesting stories about you. About a near hanging, about theft charges that may or may not have been legitimate." "I didn't steal anything," Silas said. I believe you, Calhoun said, and the words hit Silas like a physical blow. Someone in authority actually believed him. I've seen men like Frederick Garrett before, petty tyrants who abuse their position for profit. Usually they're smart enough to pick on people who can't fight back. I can fight back just fine, Silas said. I'm counting on it, Calhoun said cryptically, because I'm going to need testimony, lots of it. And I need people brave enough to stand up in front of God and the law and tell the truth, consequences be damned. You'll have it, Silas promised. Abigail returned with the stack of papers which Calhoun accepted with a grave nod. I'll review these tonight. Tomorrow morning I'll begin formal interviews. Mrs. Hart, I'll start with you, if that's acceptable. Of course, Abigail said. The marshal tipped his hat and started to leave, then paused. One more thing. I've relieved Deputy Stone of his duties pending my investigation. Sheriff Harker is on administrative leave. I'll be enforcing the law in Cold Creek until further notice. His eyes hardened. And I enforce it fair. He left, and the crowd slowly dispersed, buzzing with speculation and gossip. Silas turned to find Wright Mueller and Grace all staring at him and Abigail with the same question in their eyes. Well, Grace said finally, that changes things. Does it? Abigail asked. Or does it just make Pierce more dangerous? A federal investigation means he's got nothing left to lose. Cornered animals are the most vicious. She was right. Within hours, proof of her words came in the form of smoke rising from Chen's laundry. Silas saw at first a dark column against the evening sky, too thick and black to be a normal fire. Chen, he shouted, already running. They found the laundry engulfed in flames, Chen and his wife dragging their children out through the back door. The building was a total loss, burning so hot and fast, it could only have been deliberate. The town's volunteer firefighters formed a bucket brigade, but it was hopeless. All they could do was keep the fire from spreading to neighboring buildings. Silas worked alongside Wright and a dozen other men throwing water on the flames until his arms ached and his face was black with soot. When the fire finally burned itself out, nothing remained but smoking timbers and ashes. Chen stood with his arm around his sobbing wife, their children clinging to their legs, and stared at the ruins of everything they'd built. I'm sorry, Abigail said, appearing at Chen's side despite Silas's attempts to keep her back from the smoke. This is my fault. They did this because you helped me. No, Chen said firmly. His face was streaked with tears and ash, but his voice was steady. They did this because they are female men, not your fault, their fault. Marshal Calhoun arrived just as the last embers were dying. He surveyed the wreckage with a practiced eye, then knelt to examine something in the ashes. When he stood, he held a tin can with a rag stuffed in the opening. Accelerant, he said grimly. This was arson, plain and simple. Any idea who might have done it? Sheriff Harker asked. He'd shown up late to the fire looking disheveled and uncertain without his authority. I have several ideas. Calhoun said, his tone making it clear that Harker himself was on the list of suspects. Mr. Chen, do you have somewhere to stay tonight? They'll stay with me, Abigail said immediately. I have rooms. Mrs. Hart, you can't keep taking in everyone Pierce attacks, Grace protested. You'll bankrupt yourself. Then I'll be bankrupt, Abigail said, but I won't turn away people in need. That night the inn was full for the first time in weeks. Not with paying guests, but with refugees from Pierce's war. Chen and his family occupied one room, Wright had taken another to stand guard, and Muller was sleeping in the kitchen by the stove. The whole building thrummed with quiet defiance. Silas found Abigail in her private room, sitting in a rocking chair by the window, her hands resting on her belly. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her face drawn with worry. You should sleep, Silas said from the doorway. Can't, Abigail replied. The baby's kicking up a storm. I think he knows something's wrong. He or she, Abigail amended with a faint smile. I keep switching back and forth. Thomas wanted a son. I just want healthy. Silas stepped into the room, feeling like he was crossing some invisible boundary. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why me? Of all the people you could have saved that day on the gallows, why did you choose me?" Abigail was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the snow-covered street outside. "I saw your children's faces," she said finally, "the absolute terror in their eyes, and I remembered what it felt like to be helpless to watch someone you love suffer and be unable to stop it." Her hand moved in slow circles on her belly. "When Thomas died, I was 4 months pregnant. The logging company offered me $20 and told me to be grateful. $20 for a man's life, for my child's father, for my future. What did you do?" "I took the $20, Abigail said, "because I had no choice, because I was alone and scared and I didn't know how to fight back." She looked at Silas, her gray eyes fierce. "But when I saw you on that gallows, I realized I wasn't helpless anymore. I had money I had standing in this community, and I could choose to do something. So I did." "You saved my life," Silas said quietly. "You saved mine first," Abigail replied. "You just didn't know it. Standing up to Pierce, helping your children, building something good here, it's given me purpose. It's made me remember who I wanted to be before grief and fear made me small." Silas crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to eye level. "You were never small, Abigail Hart. You're the bravest person I've ever met." She reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle on his scarred cheek. For a moment, Silas thought she might kiss him, and he wasn't sure what he'd do if she did. But then the baby kicked hard enough that Abigail gasped and pulled her hand back. "This child has terrible timing," she said with a breathless laugh. "Maybe he's just protective," Silas suggested, sitting back on his heels. "Or she," Abigail said. They shared a smile, a moment of normalcy in the chaos. The moment shattered when Grace burst through the door. "They're coming," she said urgently. "A dozen men on horseback heading this way. Pierce is with them." Silas was on his feet instantly. "How long?" "5 minutes, maybe less." "Wake everyone," Silas ordered. "Get the children to the cellar. Right, Muller Chen. I need them armed and ready." As Grace ran to comply, Silas turned back to Abigail. "You need to hide too, the cellar with the children." "This is my inn," Abigail said, struggling to her feet. "I'm not hiding in my own home." "Abigail." "No," she said firmly. "I stood up to them once. I'll do it again." There was no time to argue. Silas could already hear hoofbeats in the distance getting closer. He grabbed the shotgun from where it leaned against the wall and checked the loads. 2 shells. He had more ammunition in his room, but there was no time to get it. They assembled in the main room of the inn. Silas, Wright, Mueller, Chen, and Abigail. Grace had gotten the children to safety, then returned with a rifle that had belonged to her father. The 5 of them stood together, armed and determined, as the hoofbeats stopped outside. "Abigail Hart," Mayor Pierce's voice rang out, amplified by the cold night air. "Come out here. We need to talk." Silas moved to the window and peered out. Pierce sat on his horse at the head of a group of men, all armed. He recognized some of them: Garrett Deputy Stone, despite being relieved of duty, and several of the rougher characters who hung around the saloon. Not quite a lynch mob, but close enough. "What do you want, Pierce?" Abigail called through the door. "I want you to see reason," Pierce replied. "This has gone far enough. A federal marshal asking questions, businesses burning the whole town in chaos, all because you're too stubborn to accept reality." "The reality that you're a corrupt thief," Abigail shot back. Pierce's expression hardened. "The reality that you're a woman alone in over your head, protecting criminals and troublemakers. The reality that you're going to lose everything if you keep this up." "I've already lost everything that mattered," Abigail said. "You can't threaten me with more loss, Pierce. I'm not afraid of you." "Then you're a fool," Pierce said. He gestured and 2 of his men dismounted. They were carrying torches. Silas's blood ran cold. "He's going to burn us out." "He wouldn't dare," Muller said. "Not with a federal marshal in town." "Calhoun's at the hotel on the other side of town," Wright said grimly. "By the time he gets here, this place could be ashes." Pierce raised his voice again. Last chance, Abigail. Come out, sign the deed over to me, and everyone walks away. Refuse, and I can't guarantee anyone's safety. There's children in here, Grace shouted. You'd burn children. Then send them out, Pierce said. I'm not unreasonable. The children and anyone else who's smart enough to know when they're beaten can leave. But Abigail Hart and Silas Boone stay. They've got a reckoning coming. Silas looked at Abigail. Her face was pale but determined. Don't you dare suggest I surrender, so she said before he could speak. I was going to suggest we fight, Silas said, but there's a dozen of them and 5 of us. Even if we win, people will die. Then what do we do? Silas's mind raced, sorting through options, discarding them as fast as they came. They could try to slip out the back, but Pierce probably had men covering the rear exit. They could hole up and hope Calhoun arrived in time, but the torches suggested Pierce wasn't planning to wait. They could surrender and hope the marshal's investigation protected them. But Pierce had already shown he was willing to commit murder. And then Silas remembered something, a story from the war, a desperate gambit that had saved his unit when they were trapped behind enemy lines. It was insane, possibly suicidal, but it was better than waiting to burn. I have an idea, he said, but you're not going to like it. I haven't liked anything about this situation from the start, Abigail said. Tell me. Silas quickly outlined his plan. As he spoke, Abigail's eyes widened. Wright swore under his breath, and Grace looked at him like he'd lost his mind. That's crazy, Muller said when Silas finished. It might work, Chen said thoughtfully. It'll definitely get us killed, Wright added. Only if we're unlucky, Silas said. And we're due for some good luck, don't you think? Abigail was quiet for a long moment, her hand on her belly, her eyes distant as she calculated odds and consequences. Finally, she nodded. Do it. Silas took a deep breath and opened the front door. He stepped out onto the porch, hands held high and empty, the shotgun conspicuously left inside. Pierce, he called, I'm coming out, just me, let's talk. Silas, no. Abigail's voice came from inside exactly as they'd planned. Don't do this. It's over, Abigail, Silas called back, putting every ounce of defeated resignation into his voice that he could muster. We can't win. Let me end this before anyone else gets hurt. He walked slowly down the porch steps, hands still raised. Pierce watched him come, suspicious but intrigued. Smart man, the mayor said. Maybe you're not as stupid as I thought. I'm a father first, Silas said, and my children don't need to see any more violence. You want the inn, take it. Just let everyone else go. That's not how this works, Pierce said. You and Mrs. Hart have caused me considerable trouble. There have to be consequences. Then the consequences fall on me, Silas said. He was close now, within 10 feet of Pierce's horse. But you let the others go. You let Abigail and the children and everyone else walk away. Tonight. No more threats, no more fires, no more anything. This ends with me. Pierce considered this, a slow smile spreading across his face. You'd sacrifice yourself for them. How noble. His voice dripped with mockery. Very well, I accept your surrender, Mr. Boone. Step forward and kneel. Silas took another step, then another, his heart hammered against his ribs. Everything depended on the next few seconds. He was 5 feet from Pierce when he heard it, the sharp whistle of Marshal Calhoun's signal. Wright and Muller burst from the inn with weapons raised. Grace appeared at an upstairs window with her rifle, and from the shadows of nearby buildings came the marshal and 4 deputy marshals he'd apparently brought with him. Nobody move, Calhoun's voice boomed across the square. You're all under arrest. Chaos erupted. Pierce's men scattered, some surrendering, immediately others reaching for weapons. Silas dove for cover as gunfire cracked across the night. He hit the ground hard, rolled, came up running. Pierce tried to wheel his horse around, but Silas launched himself upward and grabbed the mayor's coat, dragging him from the saddle. They hit the ground together in a tangle of limbs. Pierce landed a solid punch to Silas's jaw, stars exploding across his vision, but Silas held on, grappling with the older man. "It's over," Silas shouted, pinning Pierce's arms. "The marshal knows everything." "He knows nothing," Pierce snarled, still fighting. "Nothing that will stick. I own this territory." "You owned it," a new voice said. Abigail stood above them, and in her hands was a leather-bound ledger. "This was in your saddlebag, your personal accounts including every bribe, every forged document, every illegal deal, all in your own handwriting." Pierce's face went white. "That's private property. You can't." "I can, and I did," Abigail said. She handed the ledger to Marshal Calhoun, who'd appeared at her side. "Everything you need is in there, Marshal. Names, dates, amounts." Calhoun flipped through the pages, his expression growing darker with each entry. "Harlan Pierce, you're under arrest for corruption, fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder." He nodded to his deputies. "Get him up." They hauled Pierce to his feet and clapped him in irons. The mayor's earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by panic. "You can't do this. I have friends in the territorial government. I have influence." "You had influence," Calhoun corrected. "Now you have a cell waiting in Helena." He turned to Silas. "That was a damn fool stunt, Mr. Boone. Walking out here like that, you could have gotten yourself killed." "But I didn't," Silas said, touching his swelling jaw, "and we got what we needed." "You got lucky," Calhoun said, but there was a hint of respect in his voice. "Luckier than you deserved." He looked at Abigail. "And you, Mrs. Hart, stealing from a man's saddlebag in the middle of an armed confrontation while 7 months pregnant. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish." "Can't I be both?" Abigail asked wearily. Now that the adrenaline was fading, she looked ready to collapse. Silas moved to her side, offering his arm for support. She took it gratefully, leaning against him more heavily than pride would normally allow. Around them, the marshal's deputies were rounding up Pierce's men. Most had surrendered without much fight, their loyalty to Pierce evaporating the moment real authority showed up. Garrett was among them, whimpering about his innocence even as they bound his hands. "What happens now?" Wright asked, emerging from the inn with Mueller and Chen. "Now I finish my investigation," Calhoun said. "I'll need statements from all of you, detailed accounts of everything Pierce has done, every corrupt act, every threat." He looked at the crowd of townspeople who'd emerged from their homes drawn by the gunfire. "And I'll need testimony from anyone else willing to come forward. This ends here. Cold Creek gets a fresh start with honest law." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some faces showed relief, others showed shame at having stayed silent for so long. But slowly, people began to step forward. A shopkeeper who'd been extorted, a widow who'd lost her home to manufactured debts, a father whose son had been beaten by Pierce's thugs. One by one, they found their courage. Silas watched them, feeling something that might have been hope. Real hope, not the desperate kind born of having no other choice. These were people choosing to stand up, choosing to believe that maybe, just maybe, justice was possible. "Come on," he said quietly to Abigail. "Let's get you inside. You need to rest." "I need to see this through," Abigail protested, but her legs were shaking. "You've already seen it through," Silas said. "You won. Now let someone else take care of you for a change." Abigail looked up at him, her gray eyes searching his face. Then she nodded and let him guide her back into the inn. Grace met them at the door, relief written all over her face. "Is it really over?" she asked. "The worst of it is," Silas said. He helped Abigail to a chair. "Pierce is arrested, his men are scattered, and we've got a federal marshal on our side." "What about the inn?" Abigail asked. "The citations, the debts, all under investigation," Grace said. "I heard the marshal tell his deputy that any legal actions initiated by Pierce's administration are suspended pending review. That includes your eviction, the fire code violations, all of it." Abigail closed her eyes, tears leaking from beneath her lids. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Silas knelt beside her chair. "You did it. You stood up when no one else would. You fought when it would have been easier to surrender. This victory is yours, Abigail." She opened her eyes and looked at him with such naked emotion that Silas felt his breath catch. "Not mine," she said softly. Ours, all of us together. The children burst from the cellar, then Lin Chen trying unsuccessfully to hold them back. Clara launched herself at Silas, nearly knocking him over, while Eli hovered nearby, looking torn between relief and the need to appear grown up. Papa, Clara sobbed into his shirt. I thought they were going to hurt you. I'm fine, baby girl, Silas said, gathering her close. We're all fine. It's over. Eli finally gave in and joined the embrace, his thin arms wrapping around both Silas and his sister. I was scared, the boy admitted, his voice muffled. Me too, Silas said honestly, but we're safe now, all of us. Over his children's heads, he met Abigail's eyes. She was smiling through her tears, one hand on her belly where her own child grew. In that moment, Silas saw what the future could be. Not easy, nothing worth having ever was, but possible. A home, a family unconventional as it might be, a place to belong. Marshal Calhoun appeared in the doorway. Mr. Boone, I need you to come make a formal statement tonight while everything's fresh. Silas nodded and gently disentangled himself from his children. I'll be back soon, he promised them. To Abigail he said, will you be all right? I'll manage, she said. I always do. Silas followed the marshal out into the night, where the last of Pierce's men were being loaded into a wagon for transport to the territorial prison. The mayor himself sat in the back, his fine coat torn and dirty, his face a mask of impotent rage. Their eyes met across the distance, and Silas saw murder in Pierce's gaze. This wasn't over, not really. Pierce had friends, had money hidden away, had influence that stretched beyond Cold Creek. From a prison cell he could still cause damage, still seek revenge. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, they'd won. The inn was safe, the children were safe, and for the first time in 3 years, Silas Boone could imagine a future beyond mere survival. He turned his back on Harlan Pierce and walked toward the marshal's temporary office, ready to tell the truth and let justice finally be served. Behind him, in the warm glow of the Evergreen Inn, Abigail Hart sat surrounded by friends who'd become family. Her hand resting on the new life growing inside her, and allowed herself to believe that maybe kindness and courage were enough to change the world after all, even if only one small corner of it, one frozen Montana town at a time. 6 weeks passed like water over stone, slowly wearing away the sharp edges of fear until something smoother remained. Winter began its reluctant retreat from Cold Creek, the brutal cold easing into something almost bearable, and with the thaw came change that ran deeper than weather. Silas stood in the barn behind the Evergreen Inn, his breath still visible in the morning air, despite the weak sunshine filtering through the rafters. He was building a crib, his hands moving with the careful precision of a man who understood that some things demanded perfection. The wood was smooth beneath his calloused fingers, each joint fitted with a craftsman's care, each edge sanded until no splinter could threaten soft skin. You're making it too fine, Muller said from the doorway where he was watching with the critical eye of a man who'd spent 50 years working wood. It's a baby's bed, not a piece of furniture for the governor's mansion. It's for Abigail's baby, Silas said, as if that explained everything, and perhaps it did. Muller chuckled and stepped closer, running his gnarled hand along the crib's rail. Thomas Hart would have liked you, I think. He was particular about things too, used to drive Abigail half mad with his perfectionism. The old man's expression softened. But she loved him for it all the same, the caring, you see, the attention to detail that says someone matters. Silas didn't respond, just continued his work. But something warm expanded in his chest at the words, at the implicit blessing from one of Thomas's old friends. The past 6 weeks had transformed Cold Creek in ways both visible and invisible. Marshal Calhoun's investigation had unearthed corruption running so deep that 3 more town officials had been arrested alongside Pierce. Sheriff Harker, though not charged criminally, had resigned in disgrace. The new sheriff was a no-nonsense woman from Helena, named Margaret Ross, who'd served as a deputy marshal and had a reputation for fairness that bordered on legendary. But the real change was subtler, harder to quantify. It lived in the way people met each other's eyes on the street now, in the way conversations happened in daylight instead of whispered corners, in the way Frederick Garrett's general store had lost so much business he'd been forced to sell to Chen, who was rebuilding his laundry and expanding into dry goods. The town had remembered what it meant to stand together, what it cost several families had left unwilling to live in a place that had turned against a powerful man. Others had stayed chastened and determined to do better. Cold Creek was smaller now, but stronger, honest in a way it hadn't been in years. Silas. Clara's voice rang across the yard. Mama Abigail says breakfast is ready. Silas froze his hands, stilling on the wood. Clara had been calling Abigail Mama for 2 weeks now, ever since Abigail had braided the girl's hair and told her a story about a princess who was brave enough to be kind. The first time Clara had said it, Abigail had cried. Silas had too, though he'd hidden it better. He set down his tools and headed toward the inn, Muller following at a slower pace. The old man had taken to spending his days here, helping with repairs that Silas couldn't manage alone. The inn was thriving again, not just surviving, but actually prosperous. Word had spread about Abigail Hart, the widow who'd stood up to corruption, and travelers went out of their way to stay at her establishment. Some came for the story, others for the principle, but all of them paid good money. Inside the kitchen was warm and smelled of frying bacon and fresh bread. Abigail stood at the stove, moving with the careful balance of a woman in her final days of pregnancy. Her belly was impossibly round now, so large that Silas marveled she could still move at all. But move she did, with grace, hovering nearby, ready to catch her if she stumbled. "You shouldn't be cooking," Silas said, the same argument they'd had every morning for a week. "And you shouldn't be building furniture in a freezing barn." Abigail countered the same response she gave every time. Yet here we are, both doing what we choose to do. Eli sat at the table, carefully copying letters from the primer Abigail had given him. She'd taken over the children's education, and Eli had proven hungry for learning. He could write his full name now, could read simple sentences, could do arithmetic that would have baffled Silas at twice his age. Clara was setting the table, her small face serious with concentration as she placed each fork and knife just so. She'd put on weight in the past weeks, her cheeks filling out her arms, losing that stick-thin fragility that had marked her in the mountains. Both children looked healthy now, looked like children should look. "Sit," Abigail commanded, pointing at the table. "All of you, before this bacon burns and I have to start over." They sat Silas, the children, Mueller, Grace, and Wright, who'd arrived just in time. The blacksmith had become a regular at breakfast, claiming it was the best food in town. Everyone knew he was really there because he was courting Grace, though neither of them had admitted it yet. Abigail brought plates heaping with food, then finally sat herself with a sigh of relief. For a moment they all just looked at each other, this unlikely family, bound by crisis and choice. "Should someone say grace?" Eli asked. They'd been doing that lately at Abigail's gentle suggestion. Not prayers exactly, but gratitude spoken aloud. "I'll do it," Clara volunteered. She bowed her head, her small voice clear in the quiet kitchen. "Thank you for food, and for Mama Abigail and Papa and Eli and Grace and Mr. Wright and Mr. Mueller, and for nobody being mean to us anymore. Amen." "Amen," they chorused, and Silas had to blink hard against the sudden burning in his eyes. They ate in comfortable companionship, conversation flowing easily. Wright talked about an order for a new plow he was forging. Mueller described the ranch school that was taking shape, the project Abigail had envisioned, a place to feed and teach orphans and children whose families couldn't afford education. It was coming together, slowly built with donated materials and volunteer labor, but it was real. "The foundation's solid," Mueller said. "Should be able to start on the walls next week. If this weather holds, we might have a roof by April." "My brother says he can teach farming," Grace added. Show the children how to work the land, grow their own food, and I can teach them to read," Abigail said, her hand resting on her belly. "Once this little one decides to make an appearance." "Any day now," Grace said, eyeing Abigail's massive stomach with concern. "You dropped lower yesterday. That usually means—" "I know what it means," Abigail interrupted gently. "I've done this before, remember? Well, gotten this far before, anyway." A shadow crossed her face, the memory of Thomas, of the joy that should have been shared. Silas reached across the table and took her hand. The gesture was automatic now, natural. Somewhere in the past 6 weeks they'd stopped being strangers bound by circumstance and become something more. Partners, friends, maybe something beyond friendship, though neither had spoken it aloud. "You won't be alone this time," Silas said quietly. Abigail's eyes met his gray and deep as winter storms. "No," she agreed. "I won't." The moment was broken by a knock at the front door. Grace went to answer it and returned with Marshal Calhoun, who removed his hat and nodded respectfully to the table. "Sorry to interrupt breakfast," he said, "but I have news. Thought you'd want to hear it right away." "Pierce?" Silas asked, already knowing the answer. "Sentenced this morning," Calhoun confirmed. 15 years in the territorial prison. With his age and health, he'll likely die there." A collective exhale went around the table. It was over. Really, truly over. "What about his appeals?" Abigail asked. "He has money connections." "Had money," Calhoun corrected. "The territorial government seized his assets to pay restitution to his victims. That includes you, Mrs. Hart. You'll be receiving $300 in compensation for the fraudulent citations and legal harassment." Abigail's hand flew to her mouth. $300. "It's what you're owed," Calhoun said, "plus another 100 for emotional damages." He pulled an envelope from his pocket and set it on the table. "The judge was very clear that what Pierce did to you was particularly egregious, using the law as a weapon against a pregnant widow." $400. It was a fortune, more money than Silas had seen in his entire life. Enough to secure the inn's future, to fund the ranch school, to ensure the children never went hungry again. "There's more," Calhoun continued. He turned to Silas. "I did some digging into your background, Mr. Boone. Found some interesting things." Silas tensed. He'd been honest with the marshal about everything except his service during the war. Some memories were too painful to resurrect, some deeds too dark to speak of, even when they'd been done in service of a cause he'd believed just. "You served with the Montana Volunteers," Calhoun said. "Scout company, if I'm reading the records right. Saved a patrol of 12 men who'd been ambushed near the Yellowstone. Carried a wounded officer 3 miles through enemy territory. Received a commendation from General Sherman himself." The table had gone silent. Everyone was staring at Silas, who felt heat creeping up his neck. "That was a long time ago," he said gruffly. "Different life." "Different life, same man," Calhoun said. "A man of courage and honor, which is why I'm here to tell you that the territorial governor has officially pardoned you for any alleged crimes related to the incident with Frederick Garrett. Full pardon, complete exoneration. Your record is clean." Silas couldn't speak. The weight he'd been carrying, the shame of being called a thief, the fear that his children would grow up with a criminal father, lifted so suddenly he felt dizzy. "Furthermore," Calhoun continued, "there's the matter of your land near Timber Ridge. I had the boundaries surveyed. Turns out that cabin of yours sits on a plot that's rich in timber and has water rights that make it valuable. Pierce had his eye on it, was planning to claim it for unpaid taxes once you were hanged." "I don't owe taxes," Silas protested. "That land's been in my family." "I know," Calhoun interrupted. "The tax claim was fraudulent like everything else Pierce did. But here's the interesting part. Your land borders on a new territorial grant for the railroad. They're looking to buy timber rights for the line they're extending through the mountains. Your trees alone are worth about $2,000. The number was so large Silas couldn't process it. $2,000. It wasn't just wealth, it was security, legacy, future. I don't know what to say, Silas managed. Say you'll use it well, Calhoun suggested. Build something good with it. Seems to me you've already started. He looked around the table at this gathered family. Cold Creek needs more of what you people have. Community, courage, the willingness to stand up for what's right even when it costs. He settled his hat back on his head and moved toward the door. I'll be heading back to Helena tomorrow, but Sheriff Ross is solid and the new mayor they're electing next week should be honest. If the candidates I've seen are any indication, you've got a real chance here to build something lasting. Thank you, Marshal, Abigail said, for everything. Calhoun paused at the door. Thank you, Mrs. Hart. You reminded me why I took this job, why justice matters. He tipped his hat and left. In the silence that followed, Silas looked at the envelope of money, at the family around the table, at Abigail, whose eyes were shining with tears of relief and joy. 6 weeks ago, he'd been a condemned man with nothing. Now he had everything that mattered. $2,000, Wright said slowly. That's enough to fund the ranch school for years. And repair the inn properly, Grace added. New roof, new windows, everything. And buy land for farming, Mueller suggested. Get those orphans learning a trade. They all looked at Silas expectantly, waiting for him to decide. But Silas was looking at Abigail, seeing in her face the same question he'd been asking himself for weeks. Eli, Clara, he said quietly. Why don't you go play in the barn for a bit, help Mr. Muller with his project? The children recognized a dismissal when they heard one. They scrambled from the table, Muller following with a knowing smile. Wright and Grace exchanged glances, then made excuses about checking the stove and slipped away. Suddenly, Silas and Abigail were alone in the kitchen. You're going to tell me you're leaving, Abigail said. It wasn't a question. No, Silas said, and watched surprise flash across her face. I'm going to ask if you want me to stay, properly, not as hired help or temporary protection, but as... He struggled for words. As family. As yours, if you'll have me. Abigail's breath caught. Silas, I know it's soon. He continued, the words tumbling out now. I know you're still grieving Thomas, and I'm not trying to replace him. I could never replace him, but these past weeks building something with you, watching you with my children, seeing the life you've created here. He stopped, gathered himself. I don't want to go back to the mountains. I don't want to be alone anymore, and I think maybe you don't want to be alone either. I'm about to have a baby, Abigail said softly. Another man's baby. I know, Silas said. And I'm ready to love that child like my own. Same as you've loved Eli and Clara like yours. Tears were streaming down Abigail's face now. The town will talk. They'll say we're moving too fast, that it's scandalous, that let them talk. Silas interrupted. We've survived worse than gossip. Abigail laughed through her tears. We have, haven't we? She reached across the table and took both his hands in hers. Yes, she said simply. Stay. Be family. Be mine. Silas stood and moved around the table, kneeling beside her chair like he had that first night. I promise, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I promise to stand with you, to protect you and the children, to build something good here, to never run when things get hard. I promise the same, Abigail whispered. She cupped his face in her hands, her gray eyes searching his. To stand with you, to trust you with my heart and my child, to build a life worth living. She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and tentative and full of hope. Silas kissed her back, tasting salt from her tears and his own tasting the future they were choosing together. When they finally pulled apart, Abigail gasped and pressed her hand to her belly. Oh, she said. Oh, that was a strong one. The baby, Silas asked, alarm flooding through him. The baby, Abigail confirmed, and her smile was radiant despite the pain flickering across her face. I think we might need Grace after all. This little one seems to have decided now is the time. The next 12 hours were a blur of organized chaos. Grace took charge with the calm efficiency of someone who'd helped deliver a dozen babies. She sent right for the midwife Mueller for hot water and clean linens, and Silas to keep the children calm and occupied. Silas tried, he really did, but Eli and Clara picked up on his terror because that's what it was, pure terror, and grew frightened themselves. So they all ended up in the kitchen, huddled together, listening to the sounds from upstairs and trying not to imagine the worst. "Is Mama Abigail going to die?" Clara asked, her voice very small. "No," Silas said firmly, though his own mother had died in childbirth, and he knew the risks all too well. "She's strong. She's going to be fine." "You can't know that," Eli said, his 8-year-old practicality cutting through false comfort. "You're right," Silas admitted. "I can't know for certain, but I believe it, and sometimes belief is all we have." Wright returned with the midwife, a sturdy woman named Mrs. Patterson, who'd brought more babies into the world than she could count. She swept past them with barely a glance, her bag of supplies in hand, and disappeared upstairs. More waiting, more sounds, some encouraging, some terrifying. Silas paced the kitchen like a caged animal until Mueller physically sat him down. "You'll wear a hole in the floor," the old man said, "and that won't help anyone." "I should be up there," Silas said, "with her." "She's got Grace and Mrs. Patterson," Mueller reminded him. "Best help she could ask for. What she needs from you is to be here keeping things together, being ready to meet that baby when it comes." If it comes, Silas thought, but didn't say. If both of them come through this alive. The sun set, rose again. Dawn light was filtering through the windows when they finally heard it, a baby's cry, strong and outraged, announcing its arrival to the world. Silas was on his feet before the sound fully registered, racing for the stairs. Grace met him at the top, her face exhausted but smiling. "A boy," she said, "healthy, loud, and absolutely perfect. And Abigail's fine, tired but fine." Silas sagged against the wall, relief so intense it nearly drove him to his knees. "Thank God," he whispered. "Thank God." "You can see them," Grace said, "but only for a minute. She needs rest." Silas entered the room quietly. Abigail lay in the bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in clean white cloth. The baby, the boy, had a shock of dark hair and was making small snuffling sounds against his mother's chest. "Silas," Abigail said softly, her voice hoarse from hours of labor, "come meet your son." The words hit him like a physical blow. Your son. Not Thomas's son, though the baby carried that man's blood. Not just a child Silas had promised to raise, but his son claimed and chosen and loved already. He crossed to the bed and looked down at the tiny face, at the small hands curled into fists, at the new life that was somehow part of their family. "He's beautiful," Silas said inadequately. "He's ours," Abigail corrected. She looked up at Silas, and in her eyes he saw the future they would build. "I want to name him Hope, after what you gave me when I thought I had nothing left to hope for." Hope Boone, Silas thought, because that's what the baby would be, a Boone, part of their family, regardless of blood. "It's perfect," he said. Abigail shifted the baby carefully. "Hold him. He should know his father's arms." With trembling hands, Silas took the infant. Hope was so light, so fragile, so impossibly precious. The baby's eyes opened dark blue, unfocused, and seemed to look right through Silas to his soul. "Hello, son," Silas whispered. "I'm your papa, and I promise you'll never know hunger or fear or loneliness. You'll grow up safe and loved and free. All of you will. That's my vow." The baby's hand found Silas's finger and gripped it with surprising strength. In that moment, Silas understood what he'd been missing for 3 years. This connection, this purpose, this family built not from blood, but from choice and sacrifice and love. A soft knock at the door announced Eli and Clara, who crept in with Grace's permission. They approached the bed cautiously, their eyes wide with wonder. "Is that our brother?" Clara whispered. "Said, "That's Hope," Abigail confirmed. "Your brother. What do you think?" "He's so small," Eli said, sounding odd. "Was I ever that small?" "Everyone was once," Silas said. He knelt down so the children could see better. "And now it's your job to help protect him, to teach him things, to be the best big brother and sister you can be." "We will," Eli promised solemnly. Clara just reached out one small finger to touch the baby's hand, her face glowing with joy. Grace shooed them out after a few minutes, and Silas reluctantly handed Hope back to Abigail. "You need rest," he said. "I need you," Abigail corrected. "Stay with me just for a little while." So Silas pulled a chair to the bedside and took her hand. They sat in silence, watching their son sleep, listening to the sounds of their family moving around downstairs. Grace making breakfast, the children's excited chatter, Muller's rumbling laugh at something Wright said. "We did it," Abigail murmured, her eyes starting to close with exhaustion. "Against all odds, we built something good." "We did," Silas agreed, "and we're going to keep building. The ranch school, the farm, a future for all these children. Together." "Together," Abigail echoed. Her hand tightened on his. "Promise me again. Promise you won't leave when things get hard." "I promise," Silas said. "I'm here. I'm home." Abigail smiled and let sleep claim her. Silas sat watching her and the baby, this woman who'd saved his life by risking her own. This child born into a family forged by fire and choice. Outside, spring was coming to Montana. The snow was melting into streams that would feed new growth. The land was waking up, remembering how to live. And in Cold Creek, a town that had learned the hard way about courage and justice, a family was beginning its own kind of thaw. Silas Boone had come to this place expecting to die. Instead, he'd found everything worth living for. A woman brave enough to stand alone until someone stood with her. Children who deserved better than survival, who deserved joy. A community that had remembered its heart. 6 weeks ago, he'd stood on a gallows with a rope around his neck and his children watching in horror. Today, he sat in a warm room with his family, safe and whole, holding the hand of the woman he loved, watching their son sleep peacefully. The journey from that gallows to this moment had been impossible, improbable, and absolutely real. Built on mercy when the world demanded vengeance, on courage when fear would have been easier, on love chosen deliberately in the face of loss. This was redemption, Silas realized. Not forgiveness for past sins, but the chance to build something better going forward. Not the erasure of pain, but the transformation of it into purpose. As the morning sun climbed higher and the evergreen inn came alive with the sounds of family and hope, Silas understood that some salvations are only possible when two broken people decide to be brave enough to show each other mercy and humble enough to accept it in return. This was that salvation shared, hard-won, and absolutely worth every moment of fear and fight it had taken to reach it.